Hello, so hopefully I will be able to record this time. I was trying to record yesterday and it was just the internet was all over the place and it died and it was just very terrible. But now I am in a place. Anyway, so now you can see me, the daylight. I have no virtual background. This is my kitchen in the back. I have a friend of mine joining me today as I give this class, Introduction to Linguistics. So we're gonna talk about how, I even forget, this is very distracting, but we're gonna talk about what does it mean to know a language? What does it mean when we say that we know a language? What does knowing a language entail? Okay, so let's do this. Sharing screen. What does it mean to know a language? What does sharing a language entail? What do you and I know when we know a language? Da, da, da. Slideshow. Play from the start. Okay, so this is module 1. This is your first part of chapter 1. So introduction to linguistics. When we study human language, we are approaching what some might call the human essence. That is, the distinctive qualities of mind that are, so far as we know, unique to mankind. So the ability to communicate with the language that we have, that we know, is unique to us in this world. But there could be others like aliens, but who knows? For so far, it's us. We are like at the top of the linguistic chain. According to, that is, the world famous linguist Noam Chomsky, who's also known for his political commentary. And he's quite liberal in his political commentary, but then in linguistics, he's very conservative, as maybe you'll find out. Like it or not, whatever you do in life, language plays a central role. That's why the study of linguistics is so practical, and it's relevant to everybody. So I like this quote because I feel like it perfectly highlights this fact. Oh, this is nice. I could have done this. Wait a second. I'm gonna block my kitchen so you don't see it. This is gonna be my background for now. All right, so whatever else people do when they come together, whether they play, fight, make love, or make automobiles, they talk. We live in a world of language, and language comes in different shapes or forms. Now, we can talk about spoken language, which is the language that you and I probably know. Or we can also talk about gestures or facial expressions, which is also a type of language, or signed languages. So linguists contend, or they argue, that the capacity for language, perhaps more than any other attribute, distinguishes humans from other animals. Okay, so they don't think that Coco here has language. They say that animals have animal communication, humans have language. Why, you may ask? We will discuss this very soon. I'm sorry, Coco, you don't have language. Anyway, so, sorry. So what does it mean to know a language? So when you know a language, you can speak and be understood by others. You can produce a string of sounds that signify certain meanings. That means string of sounds is that you bring together sounds, and these sounds form or shape words and concepts, and these words communicate meaning. You can also understand and interpret the sounds produced by others. Language is also more than just spoken language. So deaf people, for instance, they produce and understand signed languages the same way that hearing people understand sounds. And in fact, whenever we talk about the sounds of sign language, we're talking about signs and their hand shapes and their non-manual features, right? And all of these different small components make up sign language phonology. So it's just as rich and just as systematic as spoken language. And they also go through similar language acquisition stages. So almost everyone knows at least one language. The ability to carry out conversation requires profound knowledge that most people don't know. So despite the fact that knowing a language is so universal that people think it's basic common sense, like speak a language, actually, the fact that we know language at all is super impressive and remarkable, because language is a complex system and it requires a lot of different types of knowledge. And most of this knowledge that we know or we have is done on a subconscious level. So that means that if I ask you, can you explain something to me, you may not necessarily be able to tell me precisely what you're doing with language, but you just know out of your own intuition, you just know that that's the way that you're supposed to say it, right? So it's this confidence, this knowledge, this intuition that is universal to a lot of speakers of languages, especially first language speakers. And this is true for speakers of all languages, from Albanian to Zulu. So a speaker of English can produce a sentence having two relative clauses without knowing what a relative clause is. What is a relative clause? Well, a relative clause is also known as an adjective clause, and adjective clauses inside a sentence typically give us information about the noun or the subject that we're talking about. And sometimes inside a sentence, a relative clause can be optional. That means that it provides additional information that's may not be necessary for a sentence. So for instance, in the example below, we have the elementary sentence, my goddaughter is named Disa, after a Viking queen, right? Actually, the most elementary part of this sentence is, my goddaughter is named Disa. Boom. There you have your noun, verb, and the object. So the subject, verb, and the object are there, right? But in that sentence, you also have additional clauses or additional components that are giving us more information about the categories. So my goddaughter, who was born in Sweden. So who was born in Sweden is a relative clause. And who lives now in Iowa, that's more information. After a Viking queen, also more information about Disa, that's an adverb clause. So knowing a language means knowing that we can have an elementary clause like that one, like a basic clause of your subject, verb, and object. And in that elementary clause, you can stick even more string of words and have a grammatical sentence anyway that has smaller chunks of sentences inside, right? So it's kind of like a sentence within a sentence, like a Russian doll. So what does it mean to know a language? The fact that we know something unconsciously is not unique to language. So the fact that we go through different processes or stages of language acquisition is something that maybe we can also find in children when they're learning to walk, right? So they go through this process quite organically through time, and they first start out with probably some kind of pulling and crawling, and then eventually, gaining that confidence to stand up and all that, and then eventually hold on to something and take first steps. So that same way it's something that just happens, language can be seen as that way, something that just happens from the moment that we're born, or even from the moment that we're inside our mother's womb. So when you know a language, you have so many different types of knowledges. You know how it sounds, it's the sound system, so you know what words belong to that language, what words do not belong to that language. You have knowledge of the words and its components of that language. You have knowledge of the relationship between a form and the meaning. You have an ability to create new utterances. And you have knowledge of sentences that are grammatical and sentences that are not grammatical or not possible in that language. And you also have higher level knowledge of the social meaning behind certain ways of speaking or certain utterances. So you have knowledge of performance. So part of knowing a language means knowing what sounds or signs are in that language and what sounds are not. So it involves knowledge of the inventory of sounds. So that means you know all the host of sounds that could happen in a language, but you also know as well the structure that sounds can take in that language. So you know if words can begin with a specific sound combination, whether words can end with that specific sound combination, or whether you can have it at the middle. So you have this knowledge of the sound system or the positioning of sounds. So children developed this knowledge of the sound patterns of language quite rapidly. So for instance, the string of words NK, which occurs at the end of the word sink in English, occurs at the beginning of the name Nkrumah, the name of the former president of Ghana. I don't even know how to say that. That's because I don't know that language. So meaning this combination of sounds cannot occur at the beginning of English, clearly, because I don't even know how I would go about pronouncing it. However, it can occur in Ghanese or Ghanaian language, right? So children develop an unconscious knowledge of the sounds in their native tongue from the moment that they're born. So a 1-year-old child learning English already knows that NK cannot begin in an English word. So an English word cannot begin with NK. Just as a Ghanaian child of the same age knows that it can in their language. So knowing how to combine sounds to signify concepts, or what you and I know as words, is also part of our human language. So when you know a language, you know the words in that language, and you know, sorry, I'm gonna pause this for a moment. We're having issues. So hello? So when you know language, you know the words in that language, you know the sequences of sounds or the combination of sounds that can yield potential words in that language that could have meaning, and which combinations of sounds definitely do not sound like potential words for that language. So for instance, take the famous Lewis Carroll poem Jabberwocky, found in Alice in Wonderland. So 'twas brillig, and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the borogoves, and the mome rats outgrabe. So within this first paragraph, there are certain words that you and I may recognize, such as and the, and did, and in, and the, right? But there's also new words that maybe we've never seen before, and that's because they're not in the dictionary, right? But they are made up words. They're neologisms. So they are made up. However, if you look at the sounds and at the sound patterns and the sound combinations, they sound like they could be a word in the English language. Brillig could be a word in the English language. It's not breaking any phonological rule that I know of consonant and vowel combination. Slithy sounds like it could be an adjective of toves. Toves sounds like it's a noun conjugated in the plural form. So all of these words look like potential words in the English language. And how do I know this? Because I have the higher knowledge of knowing what sounds and sound patterns can combine to yield meaningful words. So you and I have this knowledge that we probably take for granted. So the nature of the relationship between speech sounds and meaning is arbitrary. What does this mean? When we use the word arbitrary, we're talking about something that doesn't necessarily have a logical link to it, or doesn't necessarily have a reason that makes sense. It's just the way it is. It's just the way that it is, based on random choice or personal preference rather than any like logical reason. So for instance, let's talk a little bit more about how language can be arbitrary. So we can have, for instance, house. The symbols in the letters house in the alphabet, they signify the concept, mental representation of a house. If you know French, this same meaning is represented by different symbols, maison, and also different phonological sequences. If you know Russian, it's represented by dom. If you know Spanish, by casa, etc. Similarly, the concept of hand is represented by H-A-N-D in English, man in French, so M-A-I-N in French, and in Tui, roca in Russian, mano in Spanish, right? So it's completely arbitrary. There's no necessary link to these sounds and the actual concept or entity. It's just the way it is because of the language. So the same sequence of sounds can represent different meanings in different languages. So let's look at a little comic here. We need more words for our language. What are we going to call the big bird thing with leathery wings? What about pterodactyl? Pterodactyl? Well, what do you want to call it? Ron? Ron? Ron. Well, at least people will be able to spell it. So again, this is just kind of an example poking fun of pterodactyl, which is if you think about the way the sounds that we see there, they are super, the symbols at least, they are super complicated. And PT, do you know any other word in the English language that begins with PT? No, it's super arbitrary. Yet, however, for some reason, we retain this this symbolic convention to talk about that entity. So we retain that spelling, and you and I, when we read it, we probably know that what it signifies, right? But there's no direct link to the concept, and there's no logical reason why the concept has that name. It could be wrong. The same way that there's no logical reason why my name is Catherine. I could be Stephanie, which is the name of my sister. I could be Coco, who is somewhere down back there. So speakers of English understand what boy means. So we not only do we have knowledge of words and what could be potential words, and we have knowledge of the arbitrary nature between word and meaning, but we also know the meaning of boy and how a word can mean something different from another word, right? How boy could be different to toy, girl, and pterodactyl. But we also know that toy and boy are words, whilst moi is not part of the English vocabulary. So let's extend this discussion of the arbitrary relationship. So if you see a person of another sign language using a sign you do not know, it is unlikely that you will understand the message from the signs alone. So a person who knows Chinese Sign Language would find it difficult to understand American Sign Language and vice versa. So the same way that you and I are familiarized with our own sound system or our own phonology, we could also experience difficulty in trying to understand somebody else's language. So non-arbitrariness versus arbitrariness. There is some sound symbolism in certain words of the English language. So it doesn't mean that all sounds of the English language have meaning in an arbitrary way, but some of them do have some logical link-ish. So typically an example for this are onomatopoeic words, such as buzz and murmur. So the same way that in the evolution of sign language, some signs were originally like miming at the beginning, and there was a direct link between the miming and the action that the miming was signaling. Over time, these movements or these sounds became stylized, or they became an integral part of our communication, and they lost that logical link and they became more conventionalized, and different features were added and they were made more economic, such that now when you think about the words or the signs, they don't necessarily have that logical link, okay? So you wouldn't be able to decipher many signs on the basis of the hand shape or the gesture. So some exceptions to the arbitrariness of words that begin with GL in English to signal concepts to do with sight. So there are some exceptions besides onomatopoeic words. So for instance, words that begin with GL, glare, glint, gleam, glitter, glossy, glaze. What do these words have in common? They all have to do with sight and they all begin with GL. However, this is a small class of words. Not all words are like this, and not all combinations of sounds could yield this meaning. So this is an exception to the rule. So for the most part, the relationship between symbol and meaning is random. That is a takeaway point. It's random. It's not always logical. So knowledge of words. Knowing a language means knowing its words and knowing their arbitrary relationship with meaning. Ahí cerramos ese tema de knowledge of words. Moving on. Another aspect of knowing language is knowing how to creatively come up with new utterances that have never been produced before. So knowing how to combine words and sounds with our language system and creating innovation. So the creativity aspect of language is ultimately what makes humans unique from everybody else. So our ability to communicate in the abstract and innovate and produce novel sentences makes us whatever, lo chango de linguistics, the language. So this ultimately differentiates us from man-made machines that are programmed to detect human language or programmed to do speech recognition and speech generation and etc. or natural language understanding. So they will always be programmed, but where we have the upper hand is that we are creative in our language use and we're able to engage in communication in the abstract. Whereas if I ask Siri, what should I eat for breakfast?
It helps to watch what you eat. Otherwise, you don't know what you're eating.
That was innovative, but still, I feel like I could have gotten a more customized answer than that. So ultimately, that's what differentiates us from machines, from animals, etc. So language is creative and sentences potentially infinite in length and number. Any sentence can be made indefinitely longer. So not only knowledge of creativity, but knowledge that we can like keep adding to a sentence and have that sentence still be grammatically correct. So we can say, this is the house. This is the house that Jack built. This is the moth that had lay in the house that Jack built. This is the dog that worried, the cat that killed, the rat that ate, the moth that lay in the house that Jack built. Those are all grammatically correct sentences. Now, just because they're grammatically correct doesn't mean that we should utter that last one. Why? Because we'd probably lose our audience and also lose track of ourselves and what we're trying to say. So despite the fact that we have this advantage or this ability to create long, lengthy, nice, verbose sentences, we also have the knowledge, or linguistic creativity also gives us the knowledge to know when to stop, right? So if you know English, you have the knowledge to add any number of adjectives, you have the knowledge to add any number of clauses in a sentence. All human languages permit their speakers to increase the length and complexity of the sentences. That is, creativity is a universal property of human language. So I wrote a song, a new song, but we've been imprinted in our hearts to sing the same song for thousands of generations. Yes, but mine rocks. So this image is making fun of animal communication because animal communication has been studied throughout the years and patterns of animal communication are quite consistent and regular. Whereas if we were to consider that versus human language. Human language, you could definitely probably write a new song that hasn't been written before. So can other species be taught a human language? So linguists contend that most animal species possess some kind of communication system, but that the difference between animal communication and human language lies on its creative aspect. So knowing how to form sentences in our languages and understanding a finite number of well-formed sentences is also part of knowing a language. So knowing what sentences are grammatical and which ones are non-grammatical. Okay, so being able to tell the difference. So here's a bunch of different sentences. So let's look at them and read them out loud and think about which ones sound grammatically correct and which ones do not. So Carlos kissed the little lady who owned the shaggy dog. Sounds okay. Who owned the shaggy dog? Carlos kissed the little lady. Carlos is difficult to love. It is difficult to love Carlos. Carlos is anxious to go. It is anxious to go, Carlos. Carlos, who was a student, flunked his exams. Exams, his flunked student was who Carlos. Okay, so let's look at the sentences that I highlighted that are not okay in the English grammar. So, who owned the shaggy dog? Carlos kissed the little lady. That's following a sentence structure that is completely different to the one that is used in English, which is SVO. And not only that, who is who? The shaggy dog is owned by who? Carlos. Carlos needs to be there. Who can't be there? Why is Carlos following the object? I don't know. There's so many things wrong with that sentence. It is anxious to go, Carlos. What is anxious to go? Are you talking about Carlos or who's it? And how can an object, be anxious, which is a human feeling? Exams, his flunked student was who? Carlos. I'm not even going to try. I mean, you can try and tell me everything that was wrong with that sentence. Exams, flunked? Did the exams flunked or did he flunk? And also, why are we talking about his flunked? His, which is used for the possessive, versus he, which would be the correct pronoun in this case. And there's other problems as well. So this kind of knowledge refers to the knowledge of syntax, which is sentence structure, and grammar. So the rules of what constitute as a sentence is not infinite. Okay, so it's actually finite in our brains. Okay, so that they can be stored easily and economically. This means that there are a set of rules that we have stored in our brain that allow us to come up with and generate new sentences. But these rules are not exhaustive. That means that the rules are not como que al grano, dándote todos los detalles of everything that you need to know about syntax, because otherwise you wouldn't remember. So the rules are economic. So they permit us to form and understand an infinite set of new sentences. They enable us to judge whether a sequence of words is a well-formed sentence of our language or not. These rules are unconscious and we acquired them as young children and then we build up on them as we go into adulthood. So consider the following. Speakers of all languages have the knowledge to understand or produce sentences at any length. So there is no limit to the length of a sentence, but in practice, very long sentences are unlikely, okay? So that is, speakers have this advantage, this knowledge of what is usual and what is unusual in sentence construction. So they have knowledge of performance. So what is acceptable, what is unacceptable, what is appropriate, what is inappropriate, what will keep my speaker listening, what will lose my speaker, right? How can I be more economic, more brief? How can I extend my explanation and give a more lengthy explanation? So we have different competences. We have linguistic competence and we have performative competence or linguistic performance. So linguistic competence is our knowledge of words and grammar stored in our brain. linguistic performance is how we use this grammar knowledge and this knowledge of our mind in real life, in actual speech production and comprehension, and how we feed off each other's performance, and we alter the rules of how to use language in our mind. So our linguistic knowledge permits us to form longer and longer sentences by joining sentences and phrases together or adding modifiers to a noun. However, there are physiological and psychological reasons that limit the number of adjectives, adverbs, clauses, and so on that we actually produce and understand. Speakers may run out of breath, lose track of what they have said, or die of old age before they are finished. So listeners may become tired, bored, disgusted, or confused, like poor Alice when being interrogated by the Red Queen. So it's just because we have the ability to produce very long, complicated sentences doesn't mean that it's something that we would likely do, unless we're Puerto Rican, in which case we love oversharing. And here's a video of linguistics as a science that I will play for you, if this allows me. Hello, I'm pressing play. Or maybe I have to end slideshow. Oh, it says enable.
So let's talk about science. Science is awesome and important, and it holds a lot of social value. It influences everything from how we get around to how long and healthy our lives are. Even by being able to talk with you right now through the marvel of online video, you can thank science for that. But wait, isn't this a channel about linguistics? Well, you might never have thought of it this way, but linguistics is a science too. I am O.T. Lieberman, and this is the Ling Space.
Welcome to the Ling Space.
When you think about language and how people study it, science is probably not the first thing that comes to mind. After all, you don't really need to do science to it for it to be meaningful. Language is beautiful and vital. It ties into our culture and our literature, our poetry, and our music. Just as we can appreciate a spectacular night sky without worrying about astronomy, or a butterfly without thinking about how its wings work, we don't need linguistics to appreciate the way that people use language. We can just enjoy the style of a writer's individual voice, or the rhythmic flow of a well-turned set of syllables. But the thing is, whether or not you realize it, the science is always there inside language. It's part of our biological heritage, and we find a ton of things in common across every language of the world. And it's a really key social and cultural institution too, that can define communities and sell products and start wars. But all the different parts of language work according to rules that we can describe, and if we want to do that, science is how we make it happen. We need the same tools of hypothesizing, experimenting, carefully judging, and reworking that make up the backbone of science the world over. Now, the case for linguistics as a science is maybe at its strongest when you look at something like neurolinguistic testing. If you're sticking someone in an fMRI machine or an electrode cap and you're measuring their brain activity, that just screams science is happening. And we've learned a ton about the human brain and how it does its crazy language thing by using those kinds of techniques. We can say the same thing about psycholinguistic research too. There's a lot we can observe about people's behavior and how it interacts with language. We can measure how people look around a visual space when they listen to a sentence, or where their attention goes first when they hear something ambiguous. We can learn what kinds of sentences are easier or harder for people to construct by looking at how quickly they interpret them, or by checking where in a complicated sentence they get hung up. We can see how people's systems of sound work by playing the words that are mixed with background noise or static or chopped up in different ways. Some of the data from psycholinguistic research is pretty amazing. So like one of my favorite discoveries is how people can just ignore errors or missing data and make sense of what they're hearing or reading anyway. The power of native speakers to overcome problems is so huge that even when we just cut out sounds from words completely on purpose, they have no trouble filling in the blanks. A lot of the time, they don't even realize that anything was missing. How many of you noticed that there wasn't an L when I said problems earlier? Did it keep you from understanding the rest of the sentence? If you're a native English speaker, chances are that even if you were eagle-eared enough to hear it, you just skimmed right on by without even thinking about it. And thanks to linguistic science, we have all the experimental data we need to back this observation up. So experiments actually underlie a lot of linguistics research, and our tools and techniques are pretty refined too. We've studied how super tiny infants react to language before they can even speak. We've isolated the exact kind of sentences that people with aphasia have problems with, so we can figure out precisely what language impairments are made of. We can even get unbiased judgments from people about language without them realizing what we're trying to do. The number of techniques and methods for examining language is pretty huge, and it keeps growing as we find new ways to address the questions we're interested in. But linguistics isn't all experiments, though. A lot of the work that gets done is theoretical, with nary a lab in sight. The trees that we build in syntax or the rules that we describe in phonology don't really seem like science, right? Where's the science when you're just sitting there and thinking, this sentence is beautiful and perfect, and this other one is terrible garbage. I'm going to explain why by proposing a rule to divide them. Well, the theories we come up with about how language works inform all the experiments that we do. Compared to something like physics, in both fields, phenomena happen all the time, whether we're studying it or not. Stuff speeds up when it falls, and mouths move to make speech sounds. And when you research those phenomena, you get a body of data about how the world works, either physical movements and forces, or the positions and vibrations of your articulators. Both physicists and linguists then apply the scientific method to that data. With the sum of their understanding, they'll propose a hypothesis that explains what they've observed. They'll make predictions based on that proposal, and then see whether those predictions are met based on further analysis and experimentation. Let's see how that works for something like syntax. A syntactician may like words and morphemes, but what they really care about are the abstract structures underneath, the skeletons that the meanings are built from. We can't see these trees that form the base of our sentences any more than the naked eye can see an electron. But we can see the effects that different kinds of proposed structures have on the world. We can see what changes in meaning happen when you build one kind of tree rather than another, or when swapping things around makes something bad. The mission of syntax is ultimately to come up with a system that describes the structure of every language in the world. All the variation, all the kinds of meanings, all the deep similarities, we need to capture all of that. And so to verify a syntactic hypothesis, we need to test it against as many languages as we can find, and then adjust our thinking as we get more data. Science. And
I'm going to pause it there. So basically, hopefully throughout this course, you'll be able to appreciate everything that he's saying in his rant. That truly that when we talk about linguistics and throughout this course, you'll be able to like transform the way that you thought of communication into hopefully something that's more concrete and something that you can observe and make sense of. Thank you for watching.
So let's talk about science. Science is